late 552 AD, on the volcanic slopes of Mount Vesuvius. Gothic King Teia stands at the very front of his battle line, visible to every Byzantine soldier. For hours, javelins have concentrated on him. His shield bristles with embedded spears, so many that contemporary accounts describe it as too heavy to lift. He calls for a fresh shield. In that 3-second exchange, his chest is exposed. A Byzantine javelin finds its mark. The last Gothic king falls instantly. This wasn't just a king's death. According to Procopius of Caesarea and Agathias of Myrina, the primary sources who documented these events, this was the extinction of a nation. Teia commanded fewer than 7,000 starving warriors against Narses' 15,000 to 20,000 well-supplied Byzantine troops. The Ostrogothic Kingdom, which had ruled Italy for 60 years, would cease to exist within 48 hours. By the end of this video, you'll understand how primary historical sources document the terminal battle of the Gothic War, why a 74-year-old eunuch out-generaled Gothic warrior kings, and how starvation tactics destroyed what cavalry charges couldn't touch. I'm about to reveal 3 documented facts that will change how you see this forgotten extinction. First, the 2-month standoff at the Sarno River, where neither side could advance, broken only by betrayal of the Gothic fleet. Second, why displaying Teia's severed head on a pike didn't end the battle, but made the Goths fight harder for 2 full days. Third, the negotiated surrender that gave the Goths honorable terms, even in total defeat. But here's what makes this historically extraordinary. How did Teia march his entire army from northern Italy to southern Campania, nearly 400 miles through winter mountains, without Narses intercepting him? What tactical calculation made the Goths abandon their fortified river position for a mountain trap where starvation was certain? Why did Byzantine sources themselves praise Gothic valor, even as they recorded their annihilation? How did a battle fought in terrain that nullified all? Cavalry advantages become a grinding 2-day infantry melee. What message did the Goths send by continuing to fight after their king's head was paraded before them? To understand how 7,000 men chose death over submission, we need to understand what they were fighting to preserve and what Emperor Justinian was determined to destroy. In 527 AD, when Justinian became emperor of the Eastern Roman Empire, he inherited half an empire and nursed an obsession: restore what Rome had lost. The Western Roman Empire had collapsed in 476 when barbarian King Odoacer deposed the last emperor. For 50 years, barbarian kingdoms had ruled what had been Roman provinces. Justinian saw this as temporary theft, not permanent loss. He had already reconquered Vandal Africa in 533 through 534. Now he turned his attention to the greatest prize, Italy. The Ostrogothic Kingdom stood in his way. Theodoric the Great had established Gothic rule in 493, bringing Italy a generation of stability and prosperity. The Goths ruled as Romans, preserving Roman law, Roman culture, Roman infrastructure. But they were barbarians ruling Roman lands, and Justinian would not tolerate it. In 535, he launched his invasion under the brilliant general Belisarius. What followed was catastrophe. The Gothic War devastated Italy for 17 years before the final battle we're about to examine. Initial Byzantine victories gave way to stalemate, then reversal. In 541, a new Gothic king emerged who changed everything. His name was Totila, and historians document his genius. While Belisarius had conquered through military force, Totila reconquered through strategy and surprising humanity. He treated Italian civilians well, distributed land to peasants, and fought with tactical brilliance that reversed Byzantine gains. For 11 years, Totila pushed the invaders back, retaking cities, rebuilding armies, restoring Gothic control. By 551, nearly all of Italy was Gothic again. Justinian's response was to replace Belisarius with someone unexpected. In mid-551, he appointed Narses as supreme commander and gave him something Belisarius had never received: an enormous army and unlimited treasury. During 550 through 551, the Byzantines assembled an expeditionary force at Salona on the Adriatic, 20 to 25,000 men. Regular Byzantine units, Lombard mercenaries, Heruli warriors, Gepid fighters, Hun cavalry, even Persian deserters. This was the largest force Justinian had ever committed to Italy. The following spring, Narses led this multinational army down the Adriatic coast and turned inland toward Rome. Near the village of Tagenai, in July 552, he encountered Totila's army. Historians record what happened next as decisive. Totila launched a cavalry charge against the Byzantine center. The attack failed catastrophically. By evening, the Ostrogothic army had broken and fled. Totila himself received a mortal wound during the retreat. The Gothic king who had resurrected his kingdom died on the road, his body carried away by fleeing warriors. This should have been the end. The Gothic capital of Ravenna fell. Rome capitulated. Byzantine forces swept across Italy, reclaiming cities with minimal resistance. Justinian's reconquest seemed complete. The 20-year war appeared finished. But in the wreckage of Tagenai, the surviving Gothic warriors did something that defied all military logic. They chose a new king. His name was Teia, and he would lead them to glory, death, and extinction. July 552. The survivors of Tagenai, perhaps 1,000 to 2,000 Gothic warriors, faced a choice: submit to Byzantine rule or die fighting. They chose a third option: fight until they could die with honor. The Goths who had retreated northward gathered at Ticinum, modern Pavia, and performed an ancient ceremony. They raised a warrior named Teia on their shields, proclaiming him king in the traditional Germanic manner. Procopius, our primary source for these events, emphasizes that Teia possessed no royal blood. He was a military officer, Oghams who had served under Totila. His elevation was purely meritocratic, based on proven valor in combat. The Byzantine historian describes Teia's bravery during the Battle of Tagenai as equal to the heroes of legend, comparing him to Ajax and Hector from Homer's epics. This wasn't a dynasty choosing its heir. This was an army choosing its champion for a final stand. The strategic situation was hopeless by any rational measure. The Goths controlled only scattered strongholds across northern Italy. Narses' massive army held Rome and most major cities. No allies were coming. The Frankish king Theudebald had refused direct military aid despite Gothic pleas and offers of treasure. The Gothic future consisted of submission, flight, or death. Teia chose death, but death with purpose. He had one strategic objective that gave meaning to continued resistance. At the fortress of Cumae in Campania, south of Naples, Teia's brother Aligern commanded the garrison defending the Gothic royal treasury. Historical sources document that this wasn't just money. This was the accumulated wealth of Totila's 11-year reign, the financial foundation for any Gothic revival. Narses desperately needed that treasury. His multinational mercenary army required constant payment. Without Gothic gold, Byzantine control would collapse. So Teia gathered every remaining Gothic warrior he could find. Survivors from Tagenai, garrisons from northern cities, veterans who refused submission. Historians estimate he assembled between 5,000 and 7,000 men, less than half the force Totila had commanded. He included key commanders who would stand with him at the end: Sipuar, Gundulf, Gibel, and Ragnaris. These weren't professional soldiers serving for pay. These were Gothic nobles watching their nation die, choosing how to face extinction. Contemporary sources don't record speeches or motivation in modern terms, but the actions speak clearly. Teia committed his entire force to one final campaign. Not to win the war, that was impossible. Not even to save the kingdom, that was already lost. To relieve his brother at Cumae, preserve the Gothic treasury, and demonstrate that the Goths would not simply vanish into Byzantine subjugation without resistance. The numbers were impossible. The mission was suicide. That was precisely the point. What happened next was military madness, or genius. Teia's plan required marching his entire army from the Po Valley to Campania, nearly 400 miles through territory crawling with Byzantine forces. How he pulled this off remains one of the war's greatest tactical mysteries. Because Narses, the Byzantine commander, wasn't someone you could outsmart easily. Meet history's most unlikely general. Narses was approximately 74 years old. He was a eunuch. He'd spent most of his career as an imperial chamberlain, managing palace affairs and treasury accounts. Procopius describes him as standing small in stature and of abnormal thinness. Yet this elderly, castrated bureaucrat was about to do what the legendary Belisarius couldn't: completely destroy the Gothic kingdom. The paradox runs deeper than physical appearance. In an age where military command demanded warrior credentials and masculine reputation, Narses embodied everything warrior culture despised. Byzantine society, despite its Roman heritage, valued martial prowess and Andrea, manly virtue. Gothic culture elevated this further, seeing kingship and military leadership as inseparable. Both civilizations measured men by their capacity for violence and their courage in battle. Narses possessed neither by conventional standards, yet his military record was extraordinary. In 532, he had helped suppress the Nika riots in Constantinople using a combination of bribery, strategic force, and political maneuvering that saved Justinian's throne. In 538 through 539, he had commanded forces in Italy, creating a famous rivalry with Belisarius over strategy and command authority. Justinian recalled him to avoid conflict between his generals, but never lost trust in the eunuch's capabilities. When Belisarius failed to end the Gothic War, Justinian gave Narses supreme command and unprecedented resources. His victory at Taginae in July 552 demonstrated systematic brilliance. While Totila relied on shock cavalry tactics and personal leadership from the front, Narses deployed combined arms warfare with clinical precision. He positioned Lombard and Heruli infantry in the center, dismounted to form a phalanx. Byzantine cavalry and Hun horse archers protected the flanks. When Totila's cavalry charge hit the center, they found infantry they couldn't break, while arrows and cavalry attacks destroyed their flanks. The battle plan was mathematically elegant and brutally effective. Historians, particularly Ernst Stein in his Histoire du Bas Empire, emphasize that Narses' true genius lay in logistics. Maintaining a multinational mercenary army across a devastated war zone required constant supply, payment, and management. Different peoples spoke different languages, followed different customs, had different loyalties. The Lombards were fierce but undisciplined, prone to looting and arson. The Heruli were effective but required careful handling. Byzantine regular troops needed steady pay, or they'd desert. Narses kept this fractious coalition functioning through organizational brilliance and deep pockets. Contemporary sources, particularly Evagrius Scholasticus in his Ecclesiastica Historia, document another crucial element of Narses' character: his profound religious devotion. He was dedicated to the Virgin Mary, with intensity unusual even for that pious age. Evagrius records that Narses would not engage in battle without receiving what he considered a divine signal from her. Guidance he claimed to receive through prayer and contemplation. Before accepting supreme command, he built a church and monastery in Cappadocia, intending to retire there after his campaigns. This wasn't political theater. His troops believed in his divine connection, giving them absolute confidence in his leadership. While Goths fought like heroes, Narses fought like a systems analyst. His approach to warfare emphasized patience, logistics, and psychological pressure over glory and courage. He understood something fundamental. You don't need to be stronger than your enemy if you can be more patient. Hunger kills more effectively than swords. Attrition defeats valor. Time favors the side with better supplies. Narses didn't need to be stronger than the Goths. He just needed to be more patient. And he was about to prove it. As Teia gathered his forces in the north, Narses was already planning how to trap them in the south. The stage was set for the strangest standoff in military history. December 552. Teia faced a problem that military historians still debate. He needed to march his entire army, perhaps 5,000 warriors, their families. Supply wagons, from Ticinum in the north to Cumae in Campania. Nearly 400 miles, through winter, through territory swarming with Byzantine forces. The direct routes through Tuscany and Umbria were blocked by Narses' main force and scattered Byzantine garrisons. Any attempt to march down the peninsula's spine would mean constant skirmishing, ambush, and eventual destruction by superior numbers. Historical accounts document that Teia chose a circuitous route that modern scholars have reconstructed through geographical logic and scattered chronicle references. He led his force along the Adriatic coast, following the eastern shore where Byzantine control was weakest. The coastal route offered some access to Gothic-held ports and ships, crucial for resupply. Then came the difficult part, cutting across the Apennine Mountains into Campania. Winter mountain crossings tested even professional armies with good supplies. For a refugee force fleeing toward certain battle, the journey must have been brutal. The question historians still debate: why didn't Narses intercept them? He had superior numbers, better intelligence networks, and control of major roads. The answer reveals Narses' strategic calculation. Intercepting Teia's march would mean fighting in mountainous terrain where Gothic knowledge of local geography could offset Byzantine numerical advantages. It would mean dividing his force, potentially giving Teia opportunities for tactical victories. Most importantly, it would prevent Narses from choosing the battlefield. Instead, Narses repositioned. He reinforced the siege of Cumae with a substantial detachment, ensuring Alagern couldn't break out. Then he marched his main force to Campania and established a blocking position near Mount Vesuvius, between Teia's likely approach routes and the besieged fortress. Let the Goths exhaust themselves in winter marches. Let them arrive tired, hungry, desperate, then destroy them on ground of Byzantine choosing. When Teia's army emerged from the Apennines in late winter or early spring 553, they saw exactly what Narses wanted them to see. Byzantine camps spread across the plain, positioned between them and Cumae. Contemporary sources don't record the Gothic reaction, but the strategic reality was inescapable. Teia had walked into a trap. Or had he? What followed proved even stranger than the march. Between the two armies ran a river, the Sarno, called Draco in ancient sources, the Dragon. Small by Italian standards, barely 15 meters wide at most points in modern times. But Procopius describes it as deep and narrow, locked in a bed carved through volcanic rock with steep banks. You couldn't ford it. You couldn't swim it with armor. You could only cross the single bridge. And both armies wanted that bridge. For 2 months, neither side would successfully take it. Welcome to one of the strangest standoffs in medieval warfare. The Sarno River isn't impressive to modern eyes. It's a modest waterway draining the volcanic slopes of Vesuvius and the Sarno Plain. But in 553 AD, Procopius called it deep and narrow, rinserato in un letto angustissimo, locked in a very narrow bed. The volcanic geology created steep rocky banks that made crossing anywhere except the bridge impossible for armored men and horses. That single span became the focal point of two armies, neither able to advance. Teia positioned his forces on the left bank, with the ruins of ancient Pompeii somewhere nearby, though nobody in 553 knew or cared about the buried city. His camp sat close enough to the coast that his fleet could resupply from the sea. This was crucial. The Goths had no land-based supply line, and Narses controlled the productive farmlands inland. As long as Gothic ships brought provisions, Teia could maintain his position indefinitely. Both sides erected wooden towers near the bridge, mounting ballistas to control the crossing. Contemporary accounts describe machine fire, torsion-powered artillery flinging bolts and stones across the narrow stream. Any attempt to rush the bridge under this crossfire would be suicide. The result was tactical stalemate, a frozen confrontation where neither side could risk the casualties necessary to force a crossing. What makes Procopius's account fascinating is his emphasis on single combat at the bridge. He describes individual warriors from both sides meeting on the span for duels, fighting one-on-one while armies watched from opposite banks. This detail reveals Procopius's literary intentions. He's framing the Gothic War in Homeric terms, giving it the dignity of ancient epic. Whether these duels actually happened or represent stylistic embellishment, they capture the strange character of the standoff. While armies starved and empires hung in balance, champions fought for honor and reputation. For 2 months, this continued. Skirmishes between patrols, artillery duels, individual combats, neither side gaining advantage. Narses couldn't cross without heavy casualties that would weaken his army for the final assault on Cumae. Teia couldn't cross because he was outnumbered more than 2 to 1. Time itself became a weapon, and Narses wielded it expertly. The Byzantine general increased psychological pressure by constructing more towers, demonstrating his superior resources. Historical accounts record that this caused great discouragement among the Gothic forces. They could see Byzantine strength growing while their own situation remained static. Yet, as long as the Gothic fleet maintained supply, the stalemate could continue. Narses needed to sever that lifeline. According to Procopius, one man ended the standoff. A Gothic naval commander, his name unrecorded by history, surrendered his entire fleet to the Byzantines. In one act of treachery, he severed Teia's supply line and sealed the fate of the Gothic nation. The source doesn't name him. Perhaps because his identity was unknown to Byzantine chroniclers. Or perhaps because even they found his betrayal too shameful to immortalize. His motives remain equally mysterious. Was he bribed with Byzantine gold? Did he calculate that Gothic defeat was inevitable? Did personal grievance or political calculation drive him? We will never know. The immediate tactical consequences were catastrophic. Gothic resupply by sea ceased instantly. Byzantine ships from Sicily and other imperial territories arrived to establish complete naval blockade. Procopius records that innumerable ships now controlled the waters, making any relief impossible. The Goths, terrified by this development and troubled by shortage of food, made a fateful decision. They abandoned their fortified position at the river and retreated to Mons Lactarius, the Monti Latari Mountains that formed the backbone of the Sorrentine Peninsula. The mountains offered temporary safety. Byzantine forces, as Procopius notes, were prevented by the difficulties of the place from immediate pursuit. The steep volcanic slopes and rugged terrain nullified cavalry advantages and made assaulting prepared positions costly. But the Goths had traded tactical strength for strategic catastrophe. The mountains had no food. Their horses, already weakened by limited rations, would starve. The warriors themselves faced slow death by starvation. They had three choices: surrender and submit to Byzantine rule, wait on the mountain and starve slowly, or attack down the slopes against a fortified enemy force twice their size. Teia chose the third option. October 552 or early 553. The exact date is lost to history. The Goths came down from Mons Lactarius. What happened next, Procopius would compare to the heroes of Troy. What follows comes primarily from Procopius of Caesarea, the Byzantine historian who accompanied Justinian's campaigns. His history of the wars provides nearly all our detailed knowledge of Mons Lactarius. A single source limitation historians acknowledge, but his descriptions prove remarkably specific and were written within decades of the events. Where possible, we'll note corroboration from Agathias and other sources. They came down the mountain suddenly. No drums, no horns. Just 5,000 to 7,000 starving Gothic warriors charging down volcanic slopes in a compact phalanx. They left their horses behind. The terrain was too steep, the animals too weak from hunger. This would be infantry against infantry, shield against shield, man against man. The dense formation created a single armored mass, shields overlapping, spears projecting forward. This was the fulcrum, the deep phalanx that Germanic warriors had used for centuries. The attack caught Byzantine forces unprepared. Narses had been maintaining siege positions, not expecting desperate assault from a trapped enemy. According to Procopius, the Byzantine general reacted quickly, ordering his troops to form up. But here, the terrain dictated something unprecedented. The rocky slopes and confined space at the base of Monte Latari, near modern Angri, at a locality tradition preserves as Pozzo dei Goti, the Well of the Goths, prevented cavalry deployment. Narses mounted cataphracts, his Hun horse archers, his Lombard cavalry, all the mobile striking power that had won at Taganai, became useless. The Byzantines dismounted. Both armies adopted deep phalanx formation. The battle would be fought like conflicts from 500 years earlier, before cavalry dominated European warfare. No maneuver room for flanking attacks, no cavalry charges, no archery volleys from mounted warriors. Just two dense masses of infantry pushing against each other with spear and sword at close quarters. The ravines and volcanic outcrops prevented orderly formations. Battle lines weren't neat geometric arrays, but chaotic clusters dictated by geography. Procopius explicitly frames what happened next in Homeric terms. His comparison isn't modern interpretation. It's the Byzantine chronicler's own literary choice. He treats the Battle of Mons Lactarius as he would the conflicts before Troy, emphasizing individual valor over tactical sophistication. In some ways, this reflects reality. When terrain strips away cavalry, artillery, and maneuver, warfare returns to fundamentals: strength, endurance, will. The Goths and Byzantines, fighting on foot in confined volcanic terrain, were experiencing combat closer to Bronze Age warfare than to 6th century military doctrine. The clash began with pushing and thrusting. Spears found gaps in armor, shields splintered under repeated impacts. Men in front ranks died and were replaced by warriors behind them. The density of formation meant wounded couldn't retreat. They were held upright by comrades' bodies, fighting until they collapsed. Contemporary accounts don't give casualties for this initial phase, but attrition on both sides must have been immediate and heavy. Here's what makes this tactically extraordinary. Both armies, stripped of their technological and numerical advantages, fought with near equal effectiveness. The Goths, outnumbered 2 or perhaps 3 to 1, should have been quickly overwhelmed by sheer mass. Instead, their denser formation and desperate motivation created rough parity in the confined space. Technology meant nothing. Cavalry meant nothing. Only will mattered, and the Goths had nothing left except will. But this wasn't a battle of formations. It was about to become a battle of one man, because Teia did something that Procopius would describe as unmatched in all his years of recording warfare. He positioned himself at the very front of the Gothic line, and he stayed there. Imagine being a Byzantine soldier that day. You're fighting in a dense phalanx, shields locked, spears thrusting. The press of bodies around you makes movement nearly impossible. Blood and sweat make grips slippery. Wounded men's screams echo off volcanic rock. And then you see him, King Teia, not behind his lines commanding, not surrounded by guards in relative safety. At the very front of the Gothic shield wall, right where javelins and spears are densest. Fighting, not for minutes. For a third part of the day, Procopius's phrase suggesting several hours of sustained combat at the point of greatest danger. This defied every convention of 6th century warfare. Kings and generals commanded from positions where they could observe, direct, and survive. Losing the commander meant losing the battle. Personal valor was admirable, but tactical control was essential. Teia abandoned tactical sense for something else entirely. He became a symbol, a visible embodiment of Gothic resistance. Every Byzantine soldier could see him. Every Gothic warrior fought knowing their king shared their danger. Procopius provides extraordinary detail about what happened next, suggesting eyewitness testimony or detailed after-action reports. Teia acted as a champion, catching incoming javelins on his shield. Byzantine soldiers, recognizing the Gothic king, concentrated their throwing weapons on him specifically. Contemporary accounts describe his shield becoming weighted with embedded spears, so many that it became too heavy to wield effectively. The Byzantine historian's account suggests around a dozen spears stuck in the wood and leather construction, each adding iron weight that made defensive movement impossible. Teia called for his squire to bring a fresh shield. This exchange happened multiple times during the extended combat. Each time, a brief moment of vulnerability as the old shield was discarded and the new one positioned. Each time, Byzantine warriors increased their javelin throws, trying to catch the Gothic king unprotected. The physical reality of this is staggering. Hours of combat at the front rank, repeatedly catching thrown spears, managing shield exchanges while maintaining position in a fluid battle line. The strength and endurance required exceed normal human capacity. Yet, multiple sources confirm this happened. Then came the fatal moment. During one shield exchange, approximately 3 seconds when his chest was exposed as he handed off the weighted shield and gripped the fresh one, a Byzantine javelin struck true. Procopius records that it pierced him, almost certainly in the clavicle or upper chest area, and killed him instantly. The spear must have severed major blood vessels or penetrated the heart. Death was immediate. The last Gothic king fell where he had fought, at the very front of his people's final stand. Procopius, a Byzantine chronicler with every reason to minimize enemy valor and maximize Roman triumph, instead describes Teia's performance with language he reserves for legendary heroes. He explicitly compares the Gothic king to Ajax, Hector, and Achilles, the greatest warriors of Homer's epics. Not one of Homer's heroes, Procopius writes, ever performed greater miracles of valor than Teia displayed that day. This isn't grudging respect. This is genuine admiration from an enemy historian for courage that transcended political affiliation. When a king dies in battle, his army breaks. Historical precedent is absolute. Germanic armies, particularly, depended on royal leadership for cohesion and purpose. Cut off the head, the body dies. Narses knew this from decades of military experience fighting barbarian peoples across the empire. That's why what he did next should have worked. He ordered Teia's head severed, mounted on a pike, and paraded before the Gothic lines. Standard battlefield psychology. Show the enemy their leader is dead. Break their will, force surrender. It had worked for centuries, but according to Procopius, the Gothic response defied every military manual. Narses ordered the severed head displayed to the Gothic warriors, expecting immediate collapse. Instead, according to Peter Heather's analysis of the primary sources, the Goths kept on fighting until dusk on that day, and all through the next. They weren't demoralized by their king's death. They were consumed by something darker. Procopius describes them as filled with a desperate, frenzied desire to avenge Teia and die with honor rather than submit to Byzantine rule. This defied every precedent Narses had learned in 50 years of warfare. Barbarian armies typically fragmented when their king fell. The death of royal leadership meant the end of political cohesion, tribal structure, military purpose. Warriors would flee to save themselves, negotiate separate peace, or immediately surrender. The Gothic response at Mons Lactarius represented something Narses hadn't accounted for. Men who had already accepted death, for whom their king's fall confirmed rather than destroyed their purpose. They had nothing left to fight for except the manner of their ending. The Gothic kingdom was finished. They knew this. Cumae would fall eventually. Byzantine control of Italy was inevitable. But they could choose how this story ended. They could demonstrate that the Ostrogoths would not simply vanish into historical footnotes without resistance. That choice manifested as continued, intensified combat despite impossible circumstances. The fighting continued until darkness made combat impossible. Both armies, exhausted from hours of close-quarters melee, slept in their armor on the battlefield. This detail from Procopius is significant. Neither side withdrew to camps. They maintained formation, sleeping where they had fought, weapons ready to hand. It suggests Byzantine uncertainty about Gothic intentions and Gothic determination to resume at first light. The terrain prevented retreat by either side without exposing themselves to attack. So they slept among their dead, breathing the metallic smell of blood, preparing for another day. At dawn, Narses reformed his lines, expecting Gothic surrender. Teia was dead, his head displayed for all to see. The symbolic center of Gothic resistance was gone. Surely now the surviving warriors would recognize the futility of continued fighting. Instead, the Goths attacked again. The second day was not about tactics. It was about mathematics. The Goths resumed their assault with the same desperate intensity, but their numbers had diminished. The first day's combat had killed hundreds, perhaps more than 1,000 Gothic warriors. The surviving fighters were exhausted, hungry, wounded. Byzantine forces, though also depleted, maintained numerical superiority and could rotate fresh troops from rear ranks forward. What followed was grinding attrition. Procopius describes it as thrusting and hacking, simple, brutal, close quarters combat with no room for sophistication. The confined terrain prevented any tactical innovation. No flanking maneuvers, no cavalry intervention, no artillery support. Just two infantry masses pushing against each other, and the larger mass slowly, inexorably overwhelming the smaller. Here's the physics of attrition warfare. Every hour, the Gothic line grew thinner. Every fallen warrior represented a gap in the shield wall that couldn't be fully replaced. The Byzantines could draw from deeper reserves, maintaining constant pressure. The Goths, fighting on empty stomachs after days of mountain starvation, felt their strength failing. Bodies don't fight forever. Even will has limits. Byzantine casualties went unrecorded by our sources, a common pattern when victors document battles. The 2 days of infantry combat surely produced significant losses on Narses' side, but no reliable figures survive. We know only that the attrition favored the larger army with better supplies. The mathematics was inexorable. By the second evening, the Gothic line was breaking not through cowardice, but through physical impossibility of continued resistance. Then came the moment that military historians note as unprecedented in its dignity. The Goths sent envoys to Narses for parley, not to beg for mercy, not to seek asylum as defeated supplicants, to negotiate terms of withdrawal. According to sources, they acknowledged that the hand of God was against them, a theological admission that divine favor had turned against Gothic cause. But they approached negotiation from a position of demonstrated valor, not abject defeat. What Narses granted shocked contemporaries and still surprises historians. The terms represented something rare in medieval warfare: honorable recognition of defeated but unbroken enemies. The terms Narses granted were, by medieval standards, extraordinary. Multiple contemporary sources document that the surviving Goths were offered what no defeated army could reasonably expect: their lives, their property, and their freedom. They could take their personal movable possessions and whatever money they held. They would be granted safe passage to leave Italy entirely. The only requirement: they must swear an oath never to bear arms against the Roman Empire again. This wasn't unconditional surrender. This was negotiated withdrawal with honor preserved. Why would Narses, holding overwhelming military advantage, offer such generous terms? The answer lies in cold pragmatism masked as mercy. His army had just fought 2 days of sustained infantry combat. Casualties were significant, morale was strained, and exhaustion was universal. The Goths had demonstrated they would fight literally to the last man. Forcing complete annihilation would cost more Byzantine lives and time. More importantly, Narses faced strategic considerations beyond Mons Lactarius. The Frankish threat loomed. Independent warlords across the Alps were already preparing invasion forces. Narses needed his army intact and his reputation as a merciful victor enhanced. Offering honorable terms to a defeated but valiant enemy served multiple purposes. It ended the immediate threat. It preserved Byzantine strength. and it sent a message to other potential resistors that submission to Narses brought reasonable treatment. The surviving Goths accepted. Historical sources document their march northward, crossing the Po River and the Alps, dispersing into lands beyond imperial control. Some settled in Noricum, modern Austria. Others found refuge in southern Germany and Frankish territories. Approximately 1,000 Goths refused the terms, considering even this honorable surrender a betrayal. They would later join the Frankish invasion, continuing resistance until their deaths. Teia's brother Aligern, who had been defending the Cumae fortress with the Gothic treasury throughout this campaign, surrendered the stronghold after learning of his brother's death and the negotiated terms. The siege that had prompted Teia's entire southern march ended with the fortress's peaceful capitulation. The treasury Narses desperately needed fell into Byzantine hands, providing funds to pay his mercenary forces. The Ostrogothic Kingdom ceased to exist, not through final massacre or desperate last stand, but through dignified dispersal. The Gothic people who had ruled Italy for 60 years became refugees, carrying what possessions they could, leaving behind the land they had fought to preserve. Within a generation, Ostrogoth would be a historical curiosity, a name in chronicles, not a living people with political identity. They left Italy as fragments, not as a nation. Italy technically belonged to Justinian again. The reconquest was complete. The Gothic War was over, or so everyone thought, because 30,000 Franks and Alemanni were already crossing the Alps. Agathias, the Greek historian who continued Procopius's work, opens his account of the war's aftermath with a shocking claim. This turn of events led everyone to suppose that the fighting in Italy had been brought to a successful conclusion. In reality, it had scarcely begun. He's being dramatic, but his point is historically valid. Mons Lactarius ended the Gothic Kingdom, but it didn't end violence in Italy. In 553, shortly after the Gothic surrender, a massive force of Franks and Alemanni invaded the Italian peninsula. Led by brothers Butulinus and Lutherus, this wasn't a coordinated Frankish national army. These were independent warlords leading warriors in search of plunder and conquest. Contemporary sources give conflicting numbers. Some claim 30,000, others as many as 75,000. The actual size probably fell somewhere between these extremes, but even at the lower estimate, this was a force comparable to or larger than the Gothic army Narses had just destroyed. The 1,000 Goths who had refused surrender terms at Mons Lactarius joined the Frankish invasion. For these Gothic holdouts, the war continued. They would fight alongside Franks until their deaths, maintaining armed resistance to Byzantine rule despite impossible odds. Their presence with the Frankish force gave the invasion a veneer of legitimacy as continuing the Gothic cause, though the Franks' actual objective was pure conquest and enrichment. Narses spent the year from 553 through 554 maneuvering against this new threat. Unlike the Goths, whom he could diplomatically isolate, the Franks had powerful kingdoms backing them. Unlike his Lombard mercenaries, whom he could pay off and dismiss after the Gothic War, the Franks demanded Italy itself. He had to fight them directly. The campaign proved more challenging than defeating the exhausted Gothic remnant at Mons Lactarius. The decisive confrontation came at the Battle of Vulturnus, also called Casilanum, near Capua in 554. Narses deployed tactics reminiscent of Hannibal's masterpiece at Cannae centuries earlier, an envelopment that surrounded and annihilated the Frankish army. The Byzantines achieved complete victory, eliminating the Frankish threat and securing Byzantine control of southern Italy. Only after this battle, 2 years after Mons Lactarius, Could the Gothic War be considered truly concluded? The irony is profound. Historians spend considerable attention on Mons Lactarius as the Gothic Kingdom's terminal battle. Yet in practical military terms, the Battle of Vulturnus was equally significant for establishing Byzantine dominance in Italy. The Frankish invasion demonstrated that destroying one barbarian kingdom didn't automatically restore imperial control. It revealed the fragility of Narses' victory and the exhaustion of Byzantine resources. Most significantly, it presaged future invasions that would ultimately undo everything Justinian had fought to achieve. Narses had achieved the impossible. After 20 years of war, Italy was Roman again. The reconquest was complete. Justinian's dream of renovatio imperii, restoration of the Roman Empire to its ancient glory, had been realized in the Italian peninsula. But historians universally describe this achievement as pyrrhic, a victory that destroyed what it sought to save. The devastation defies easy quantification. Italy had been a battlefield for 2 decades. Armies had marched across the peninsula repeatedly, living off the land, destroying resources to deny them to enemies, besieging cities until starvation forced surrender. Contemporary sources document widespread famine, depopulation, and economic collapse. The war that brought Italy back under Roman control had eliminated Italy's capacity to function as a productive province. The financial catastrophe compounded the human cost. Justinian had bankrupted the imperial treasury funding Narses' campaigns. The Gothic War consumed resources desperately needed elsewhere, against Persia, against Berbers in North Africa, for maintaining defenses along the Danube frontier. The reconquered Italian provinces, devastated and depopulated, couldn't generate tax revenue sufficient to maintain the garrisons necessary for their defense. The equation was unsustainable. Massive investment, minimal return, ongoing expense. Narses remained in Italy as governor until 567, struggling to rebuild from ruins. He tried to restore infrastructure, re-establish administration, and collect taxes from a population that had nothing left to give. The Italians, who had initially welcomed Byzantine liberation from Gothic rule, now faced Byzantine taxation and bureaucratic control. Contemporary papal correspondence describes the misery, poverty, destitution, continued violence from undisciplined troops. The promised restoration looked increasingly like occupation. Then came the final irony that proves the victory's pyrrhic nature. In 568, just 15 years after Mons Lactarius, the Lombards invaded. These were the very warriors who had fought as Narses' mercenary allies, whose 5,500 troops had been crucial to Byzantine victories at Taganai and elsewhere. Now they returned as conquerors, recognizing that devastated Italy couldn't resist organized invasion. Byzantine forces, weakened by garrison reductions and financial constraints, couldn't mount effective defense. The Lombards conquered most of northern and central Italy, establishing a kingdom that would endure for 2 centuries. Byzantine control fragmented into scattered holdings around Ravenna, Rome, Naples, and southern coastal regions. The reconquest that had cost 20 years of warfare and untold treasure lasted barely a generation before Italy fractured again. The territorial gains Justinian had sacrificed so much to achieve proved temporary, and Byzantine Italy would never recover its unity or prosperity. Narses lived until 573, dying at approximately 95 years old. He witnessed the Lombard invasion that undid his life's military achievement. The efficiency that had destroyed the Gothic kingdom couldn't preserve Byzantine Italy against new waves of barbarian settlement. The systematic warfare that had triumphed over Gothic heroism proved insufficient for long-term imperial restoration. History records his military genius while simultaneously documenting the futility of his greatest victory. Mons Lactarius wasn't just a battle between armies. It was a collision between completely different philosophies of warfare. That collision revealed which philosophy would dominate the next 1,000 years of military history, and which would survive only in literature and memory. Consider the Gothic approach embodied by Teia. Individual valor was paramount. A king proved his right to rule through personal courage and combat prowess. Teia positioned himself at the very front of his army, fighting where death was most likely, because Gothic culture demanded visible royal leadership in battle. He spent hours catching javelins on his shield, not because this was tactically sound, but because it demonstrated the courage that legitimized his kingship. When he died as Gothic kings were supposed to die, at the front, weapon in hand, facing enemies directly. This wasn't stupidity. It was cultural coherence. Gothic society was built on warrior values where personal reputation for courage determined social standing and political authority. A king who commanded from safety while subjects died would forfeit legitimacy. Teia's frontline position was politically necessary within Gothic cultural logic. His death poem, his willingness to die visibly, his refusal to seek safety. All of this made sense within a worldview that valued honor and courage above survival and victory. Contrast this with Narses' approach. The Byzantine general commanded from positions of safety, surrounded by bodyguards and standard bearers, observing the battlefield to make tactical decisions. He never personally engaged in combat. His value lay not in personal martial prowess, but in organizational genius, strategic calculation, and logistical management. He won battles through superior supply, better intelligence, calculated attrition, and psychological warfare like the Sarno river blockade and fleet betrayal. Narses understood something the Goths didn't or couldn't accept. Warfare was becoming systematic rather than heroic. Victory went to commanders who managed resources, maintained discipline, exploited enemy weaknesses, and accepted that glory mattered less than results. The 2-month standoff at the Sarno perfectly illustrates this. Teia wanted honorable battle. Narses wanted starvation victory. Systematic warfare triumphed because hunger is more reliable than courage. Which philosophy won history? Modern warfare follows Narses, not Teia. Military academies teach logistics, supply chain management, intelligence gathering, combined arms coordination, all Narses' strengths. They don't teach placing generals at the front rank of infantry phalanxes. Contemporary military doctrine emphasizes preservation of command and control, recognizing the commander's tactical decisions matter more than their personal combat performance. Narses was the future. Teia was the past. Yet something persists. The heroic tradition survived in literature, legend, and cultural memory precisely because it lost militarily. Teia's death became memorable because it was extraordinary, a throwback to ancient warrior codes in an age of systematic warfare. Procopius compared him to Homeric heroes because his courage stood out as anachronistic even in the 6th century. Efficiency won. Glory endured. Both commanders achieved a kind of immortality, one through victory, one through the manner of his defeat. Here's what makes Procopius's account extraordinary. He was a Byzantine historian writing for a Byzantine audience. Teia was the enemy, the barbarian trying to prevent Roman reconquest. The Goths represented everything Byzantine civilization defined itself against. They were Germanic invaders ruling Roman lands through military force rather than legitimate authority. Yet Procopius describes Teia's final stand with language he reserves for the greatest heroes of antiquity. Why would a Roman historian praise the man trying to destroy Rome? The answer reveals something fundamental about Byzantine culture. Despite being medieval Christians, Byzantine-educated elite remained deeply connected to classical Greek education and values. Procopius would have studied Homer extensively, memorizing passages from the Iliad and Odyssey, learning to identify and appreciate arete, excellence, and Andrea, manly virtue. These classical values transcended ethnic boundaries. When Procopius saw genuine excellence, even in enemies, his classical education demanded recognition. Byzantine society in the 6th century maintained sophisticated appreciation for courage and honor as abstract virtues. A warrior who displayed extraordinary bravery, even fighting against Byzantine interests, demonstrated qualities the culture valued. Recognizing enemy excellence didn't weaken Byzantine claims to superiority. Rather, it magnified victory. If Teia was merely a cowardly barbarian, defeating him meant nothing. But if Teia fought with Homeric valor, Narses' victory became proportionally greater. There's also a propaganda function to Procopius's praise. Justinian's Gothic War had dragged on for 20 years, consuming vast resources and producing ambiguous results. Byzantine audiences needed explanation for why the war was so difficult and costly. Presenting the Goths, and Teia specifically, as worthy opponents justified the extended campaign. You can't admit the enemy was weak without making your own armies look incompetent for taking 2 decades to achieve victory. Yet something in Procopius's language exceeds propaganda necessity. The specific details about Teia's shield exchange, the comparison to Ajax and Hector, the statement that not one of Homer's heroes performed greater miracles of valor, this reads like genuine admiration. The shield detail particularly suggests eyewitness testimony or detailed after-action reports. Someone watched Teia catch javelins for hours, counted the spears embedded in wood and leather, documented the fatal moment when his chest was exposed. That level of specific observation indicates more than propaganda construction. Byzantine culture allowed, even encouraged, this complex moral perspective. Being Roman didn't mean demonizing all enemies. It meant appreciating excellence wherever it appeared, then defeating it through superior civilization and divine favor. In praising Teia, Procopius revealed what Rome actually meant to educated Byzantines. Not geography, not ethnicity. A set of values that could be embodied even by those who fought against Rome. Courage, honor, loyalty, willingness to die for principles. These transcended the Roman barbarian divide in classical ethical framework. The Ostrogothic Kingdom was destroyed. The people dispersed across Europe, losing political identity within a generation. By every political and military measure, Teia failed completely. Within 50 years, Ostrogoth became a historical curiosity, a name in old chronicles, not a living ethnic or political entity. So why does Teia's name echo through 1,500 years when most contemporary kings are forgotten? The answer lies in what Procopius's account preserved. Without his history of the wars, Mons Lactarius would be a footnote, maybe a paragraph noting that Narses defeated the last Gothic army in southern Italy. Instead, we have detailed documentation of Teia's courage, the shield exchange, the comparison to Homeric heroes. We have the story of Goths fighting for 2 days after their king's severed head was displayed. We have the negotiated surrender that acknowledged Gothic valor even in total defeat. Political extinction became literary immortality. The Goths lost everything except their story. That story mattered because it demonstrated something universal about resistance, honor, and choosing how to face inevitable defeat. Teia couldn't save his kingdom. He couldn't defeat Narses. He couldn't even meaningfully damage Byzantine military capacity. But he could control how the Gothic nation ended. He could ensure that when historians wrote about the Ostrogoths' extinction, they would record something beyond simple military defeat. The intelligence gathered during the campaign, though not emphasized by sources, had practical value. Gothic observations of Byzantine tactics, weaponry, and vulnerabilities documented during the march and standoff provided information to other barbarian peoples facing Byzantine expansion. The lessons from Mons Lactarius about Byzantine combined arms, warfare, logistical superiority, and systematic approach influenced how subsequent invaders like the Lombards planned their own campaigns. More significantly, the negotiated terms set precedent. By refusing unconditional surrender and instead negotiating withdrawal with property and honor intact, the Goths proved that fierce resistance could extract concessions even from victorious Byzantine forces. The medieval world took note. Submit immediately, and you get whatever terms the conqueror imposes. Resist to the point of mutual exhaustion, and you can negotiate dignity in defeat. This lesson resonated across subsequent centuries of European warfare. The cultural memory persisted in ways political extinction couldn't erase. Italian place names like Pozzo dei Goti preserve battle memory 15 centuries later. Medieval literature incorporated Gothic resistance as symbol of defiant courage. The story of men choosing death over submission became template for understanding heroic defeat, influencing how later cultures interpreted similar last stands. The Goths themselves vanished. The Gothic example endured. Mons Lactarius was a small battle by ancient standards, fewer than 25,000 total combatants. Lasted 2 days. Decided nothing strategically. Italy would change hands again just 15 years later when Lombards invaded. Yet, historians study it 1,500 years later. Why? Because it crystallized eternal questions about empire, resistance, and the price of civilization. Consider Justinian's dilemma. He wanted to restore Rome, to reassemble the empire his predecessors had lost to barbarian kingdoms. The ambition was legitimate by imperial logic. These were Roman provinces stolen by invaders. Reconquest represented historical justice, returning stolen lands to rightful owners. But the method of restoration destroyed what he sought to preserve. 20 years of warfare devastated Italy more thoroughly than barbarian rule ever had. The victory that brought Italy back under imperial control eliminated Italy's capacity to function as a productive province. You can't conquer paradise without burning it. This pattern repeated throughout imperial history. Roman, Byzantine, Ottoman, European colonial powers. The military campaign necessary to establish control creates destruction that makes control valueless. Justinian achieved territorial restoration, but lost financial viability. The equation never balanced. Investment exceeded return. Maintenance costs exceeded productive capacity. The Pyrrhic victory proved worse than accepting Gothic rule would have been. Yet, from Byzantine perspective, acceptance was impossible. Imperial ideology demanded territorial integrity. Legitimacy depended on claiming continuity with ancient Rome, which meant reclaiming Rome's territories. Justinian couldn't be a legitimate Roman emperor while barbarians ruled Italy. The practical costs, financial catastrophe, depopulation, devastation, mattered less than ideological necessity. Empire required these sacrifices, even when the sacrifices made empire unsustainable. Now consider the Gothic paradox. Teia knew he couldn't win. The strategic situation after Teginai made Gothic revival impossible. Narses commanded superior forces, controlled key territories, and had unlimited financial backing. Every rational calculation pointed toward surrender, negotiation, and Gothic survival through submission. But Teia chose death over submission, leading his people into a battle they knew they would lose. Was this stupidity or wisdom? From survival perspective, it was catastrophic. The 1,000 or so Goths who accepted immediate surrender rather than fighting at Mons Lactarius lived. They kept their property, crossed the Alps, and probably survived to establish families in new lands. The thousands who fought at Mons Lactarius died, many of them painfully over 2 days of combat. Survival logic clearly favored surrender, but Teia wasn't fighting for survival. He was fighting for meaning. The Goths understood something about historical memory. How you die defines who you were. Immediate surrender after Teginai would have meant the Ostrogoths simply evaporated when Byzantine pressure became too strong. Future historians would write, and then the Goths surrendered and dispersed, ending their kingdom without significant resistance. That ending would have meant political extinction without cultural legacy. By fighting at Mons Lactarius, by choosing 2 days of grinding combat over immediate capitulation, by forcing Narses to negotiate rather than simply accepting dictated terms, the Goths transformed their ending. They ensured that when historians wrote about Ostrogothic extinction, they would write about extraordinary courage, impossible resistance, and dignity maintained even in total defeat. They chose their story over their survival. Both choices, imperial reconquest despite unsustainable costs and resistance despite inevitable defeat, appear irrational from practical perspectives. Yet both made sense within their respective value systems. Justinian valued ideological legitimacy over practical sustainability. Teia valued historical memory over physical survival. Empire demanded these contradictions. Resistance required these calculations. Mons Lactarius forces us to choose what we value: pragmatic survival or meaningful death, efficient victory or memorable resistance, the system that wins or the spirit that endures. These tensions weren't resolved on that battlefield. They can't be resolved. They're what make us human. Late 552 AD, on the volcanic slopes of Mount Vesuvius, Gothic King Teia stands at the very front of his battle line, visible to every Byzantine soldier. For hours, javelins have concentrated on him. His shield becomes too heavy to lift from embedded spears. He calls for a fresh shield. In that 3-second exchange, his chest is exposed. A Byzantine javelin finds its mark. The last Gothic king falls instantly. This wasn't just a king's death. According to Procopius of Caesarea and Agathias of Myrina, the primary sources who documented these events, this was the extinction of a nation. Teia commanded fewer than 7,000 starving warriors against Narses' 15,000 to 20,000 well-supplied Byzantine troops. The Ostrogothic Kingdom, which had ruled Italy for 60 years, would cease to exist within 48 hours. By the end of this video, you'll understand how primary historical sources document the terminal battle of the Gothic War. Why a 74-year-old eunuch outgeneraled Gothic warrior kings, and how starvation tactics destroyed what cavalry charges couldn't touch. I'm about to reveal 3 documented facts that will change how you see this forgotten extinction. First, the 2-month standoff at the Sarno River, broken only by betrayal of the Gothic fleet. Second, why displaying Teia's severed head didn't end the battle but made the Goths fight harder for 2 days. Third, the negotiated surrender that gave the Goths honorable terms, even in total defeat. But here's what makes this historically extraordinary. How did Teia march 400 miles through winter mountains without Narses intercepting him? Why did displaying the dead king's head backfire so completely? How did a battle in terrain that nullified all advantages become a 2-day infantry melee? What message did the Goths send by continuing to fight after their king's death? To understand how 7,000 men chose death over submission, we need to understand what they were fighting to preserve, and what Emperor Justinian was determined to destroy. Remember that moment. Teia, at the front of the Gothic line, calling for a fresh shield. Multiple Byzantine spears embedded in wood too heavy to lift. 3 seconds of vulnerability, a javelin finding its mark. This detail comes to us from Procopius, a Byzantine historian who had every reason to minimize enemy valor and every reason to glorify Roman victory. Instead, he compared this barbarian king to the heroes of Homer. That choice reveals something profound about what civilizations actually value when stripped of political necessity and propaganda pressure. The numbers tell a brutal story. Contemporary sources document approximately 5,000 to 7,000 Gothic warriors at Mons Lactarius, facing 15,000 to 20,000 Byzantine troops. The battle lasted 2 days of sustained infantry combat in terrain that nullified cavalry advantages and tactical sophistication. When it ended, the Ostrogothic Kingdom ceased to exist as political entity. The survivors negotiated honorable terms, left Italy, and dispersed into history. Within 1 generation, Ostrogoth became a curiosity, the name of an extinct people. Narses lived another 20 years, governing the Italy he had conquered until recalled in 567 at age 89. He died in 573, having witnessed the Lombard invasion that undid his life's work. The reconquest that cost 20 years of warfare, uncounted treasure, and devastating human toll lasted barely 15 years before Italy fragmented again under new barbarian kingdoms. The victory was complete. The triumph was pyrrhic. Within 3 years of Narses' death, Lombards controlled most of Italy, and the Byzantine Empire would never recover its western provinces. But Teia's name survives. A minor king who reigned less than 1 year. A warrior who led his people to certain death at a forgotten battle on volcanic slopes. Why? Because Procopius couldn't help but document what he saw. A man who chose the manner of his end when he couldn't choose his fate. The Byzantine chronicler, writing for an empire that valued order, efficiency, and systematic power, recognized something in Gothic defiance that transcended political affiliation. Excellence, courage, and the refusal to simply vanish. These qualities demanded recognition regardless of which side demonstrated them. Mons Lactarius reveals eternal truths about power and resistance. Empires measure victory in territory controlled, cities captured, enemies subjugated. They rarely measure what they destroyed to achieve it, or whether their victories can endure. Justinian achieved territorial restoration at the cost of Italian devastation, creating control too expensive to maintain. The restored empire lasted barely long enough for contemporaries to recognize its futility before Lombards proved Byzantine weakness. By imperial metrics, the Gothic War was catastrophic overreach masked as triumph. Resistance movements measure something entirely different. Success isn't survival or victory. It's maintaining dignity in defeat, choosing their end rather than accepting dictated terms, ensuring that extinction receives documentation as defiant rather than passive. The Goths achieved none of their political objectives. They saved nothing preserved nothing, accomplished nothing by practical measures. But they controlled their story. When historians wrote about Ostrogothic extinction, they wrote about courage, not cowardice, about choice, not submission, about meaning maintained through impossible circumstances. History remembers both Narses and Teia, the efficient general who restored an empire for a generation through systematic brilliance, the doomed king who fought for 2 days with his kingdom already lost. One was more successful by every practical measure. Both were necessary for understanding what war actually means beyond tactical outcomes and strategic consequences. The tension between them, system and spirit, pragmatism and honor, survival and meaning, wasn't resolved at Mons Lactarius. It can't be resolved. It defines what it means to be human when confronted with power and choice. The last Gothic king fell in 553 AD with a javelin in his chest and multiple spears in his discarded shield. The Byzantine Empire collapsed 900 years later in 1453. The question they embodied lives on. What matters more? The victory that achieves nothing lasting, or the defeat that refuses to be forgotten?